Well, hello again, friends, and it's good to be able to join you this way. I think for many of us, we would much rather be in person in a hall together, as we could study the scriptures face to face and in person. And I think in many ways that'd be much better. But at the same time, there's some of you joining us today virtually who would not be available to join us or not be capable of joining us if we were having it on location somewhere. So wherever you are, wherever you're choosing to join us from, welcome. Thanks for being part of our special teaching time today. Now, we're going to have 2 sessions with a break in the middle, just so you know. And during that break, you might get some information about some ministry resources, but just remember, there'll be 2 very different parts. And as we do, we're going to be talking about a Bible character. Now, we've started doing that many years ago because we came to understand and realize that within the pages of the scripture, there are many issues and ideas that are frankly abstract and sometimes kind of hard to get our heads around. And we found that if we could find those ideas kind of encased in the life and the story of a person, they're a little easier to grasp and to process and to apply to our own lives. So we started doing these Bible characters, and when it came time to plan for this day of teaching, I presented several different options to our staff there, and they talked about it and prayed about it, and they came back and said, you know what? We think we'd like to study Judas. And I thought, wow, okay, let's go. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to study Judas Iskariot. Judas, in a sense, the tragic traitor. It is a very, very tragic story for a lot of reasons that we'll see as we unpack the story together today. But what's very interesting is that even though he was tragic, he was still a traitor. And the act of treason or betrayal that he committed against Jesus was absolutely premeditated. See, there are some who have tried to kind of validate and vindicate Judas from the wrongdoing of betraying Jesus, the Son of God. In the book, The Passover Plot, that came out some years ago, Judas is actually presented as a good guy. And it's the other disciples that are the bad guys, because the Passover Plot is they've decided to create a myth that Jesus rose from the dead, even though he hadn't. And so they're the villains because they're telling a gospel that's not true. They're telling a resurrection story that's false. Judas is the good guy. In the rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, in a sense, Judas is kind of the most clear-thinking person in the whole thing. And not surprisingly, once again, there's no resurrection. The story ends with Jesus dead, hanging from a cross. In the TV miniseries, Jesus of Nazareth, which I think in many ways was exceptionally good, still it presents Judas as kind of a victim of his times. He's kind of a guy who got caught up in the political machinery of the day, and he kind of got pushed down this road, and all of a sudden he just betrayed Jesus. And quite candidly, none of those things are true. I wish we could absolve him of any human responsibility on this, but as we'll see throughout our time together today, it's just not so. In fact, the only source we have for information about Judas and what he did is from the Bible. And the Bible makes it very clear that not only did Judas do this sinful thing of betraying Jesus, he did it in partnership with the forces of darkness, and it was premeditated. It wasn't just this last minute, oh no, what do I do now? I'll do this. And then he betrayed Jesus. No. We'll see that there were actually some active preparations. This was a premeditated act. And we may even see some reasons as to why Judas sought to do that. So I want you to join us for what I hope and I trust will be a helpful and not just informative and instructive, but also perhaps even enlightening and insightful time to where the lessons we learn from Judas can maybe inform us a little bit about our own hearts, because that would be helpful as well. So let's begin. And let's begin in this first session. We're going to start off by trying to get as much information about who Judas is as we can. And then we're going to look at the one incident where he really steps center stage before the events of the Passion. And then we'll see those preparations, those premeditated preparations to betray the Son of God. So let's begin by looking not only at who he is, but also by taking a look at who he isn't, because it's very interesting. There are a number of men named Judas in the New Testament. He's not the only one. One of them is a man we normally refer to as Jude, although his proper name in Hebrew would have been Judas. It would have been the same name as Jude. And this Jude is the author of the book of Jude, the next to the last book in the New Testament. And he was a half-brother of Jesus, a brother of James, who went on to be one of the pastoral leaders of the church in Jerusalem. This Jude, who wrote the book of Jude, was a Judas who was a half-brother of Jesus. A second Jude, or Judas, was actually described in one of the Gospels as Judas, not Iscariot. Now, if you were one of the disciples and you were named Judas, from the time of Judas's betrayals on, if you introduced yourself to anybody, you would introduce yourself as, "Hi, I'm Judas. I'm one of the disciples." Not Iscariot. No, not him. This Judas is also known as Thaddeus or Lebbaeus, depending on which of the Gospels you're looking at. But he's identified as not Iscariot in John 14 in the upper room when he asks Jesus a question after Judas Iscariot has already left to go make the betrayal. A third Judas is found in Acts chapter 5. It's a Galilean who, shortly after the birth of Jesus, led a revolution, a revolt in sedition against Roman rule. And of course, that Roman rule was able to suppress that sedition. And even though Judas the Galilean and his followers paid the price for what they did, their efforts were not forgotten, because years later in Acts chapter 5, he's still remembered. Another Judas is a Judas that Paul lodged with in Damascus in Acts chapter 9, and another was a prophet named Barsabas, who was sent with Silas to Antioch in Acts chapter 15. So we have a number of Judases, but only one, Judas Iscariot. So what does that name mean? Well, someone said everything Judas touched, he tainted, including his name. And that's actually kind of true. Sadly, this is part of the tragedy part of it. The name Judas in the Hebrew means praise to the Lord. It comes from the same name as Judah, one of the tribes of Israel. Praise to the Lord. How tragic that name that was intended to honor God became a name that would be vilified and hated and despised. Matthew Coder, in his little commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, said a man might name his son Peter or Paul. He might name his dog Nero or Caesar, but no one would even name a dog Judas. That beautiful, lovely name has been spoiled by Judas's act of treachery. The name Iscariot actually has a little bit of mystery to it, but either way, it has some implications that are kind of interesting for us to consider. If you break it down into its parts, the name, the name Iscariot is Iskariot. Iskariot. Now, some say that Iskariot means man of the Sicarii, or dagger man, an assassin. There was a group of zealots who were assassins, and they used a small dagger, and they could slip into a crowd and assassinate someone and then slip away and never be caught. Some say that this is what Iscariot means. It means he's a dagger man. He was an assassin. And if so, within the 12 disciples of Jesus, there was a man named Simon the Zealot that probably would have gotten along well with Judas, because zealots were in favor of using violent means to overthrow Rome. Very interesting. The other interpretation of it is not dagger man, but Iskariot is Ish, man of Kirioth, a village perhaps south of Jerusalem. It's not certain, but some have speculated that. Now, if that's true, then that makes a very interesting dynamic within the group of the 12 followers of Jesus, because all of the other followers of Jesus in that first band of 12, all of them, as far as we can tell, were Galilean. If Judas was from a village south of Jerusalem in Judea, he would have been the only non-Galilean disciple. And that would have made him a little bit of an outsider, even in that inner group of the 12. He would have been an outsider, which would have made for some interesting dynamics within that group of people. As far as his hometown, we don't know, unless that's true. We don't know anything about him, except we are told that his father's name was Simon. He was Judas Iskariot, son of Simon Iskariot. We'll see that a little bit later as we get into the story some. The only other thing we know, and we'll see this in more detail in a moment, is that he had a role, a specific role within the group of the disciples. And that role within the group of the disciples was he was the group's treasurer. He was in charge of maintaining the finances, to handling the money bag or the money box, depending on which translation you use. But he was the one in charge of that. And he was in charge of the group's resources, and he was in charge of paying the bills and buying the needs and taking care of all those different things. Judas was in charge of all that. And that's very interesting, because that means that something of value was entrusted to him, undoubtedly by Jesus himself. In a sense, this was one of the beginning ways, in addition to calling Judas to being one of his disciples, this was one of the beginning ways of Jesus reaching out to Judas by trusting him, by entrusting the welfare of the group to him, by reaching to him in a very tangible and significant and important way. Other than that, we really don't know very much about Judas. We know that he was one of the 12. We know that in the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's always listed last, and it's always Judas Iscariot who would betray him. That is always in there, so that we never lose sight of the fact that even within Jesus's closest group of followers, there was treachery there. There was treachery there. So where do we see him enter the story? Well, let's look at that. And if you have your Bible, I'd encourage you to look at John chapter 12, verses 4 through 8, because this is really the first time, other than those lists in the synoptic gospels, where Judas is mentioned, except in John 6:71, where he is mentioned again in advance, a foreshadowing of the one who would betray him. It's a very telling thing. Every time it's the one who would betray him, the one who would betray him, the one who would betray him. The writers of the Gospels want this to sink in. The writers of the Gospels want this to matter to us. That here, walking with Jesus and living with him and observing him and learning from him, this guy, this Judas Iskariot, would betray him. Very interesting. But we don't really start to get a tiny little glimpse into his character until John chapter 12. Now, John chapter 12, absolutely without any coincidence whatsoever, immediately follows John chapter 11. Now, that's not interesting because the numbers work, but it's interesting because the event follows the events of John chapter 11. And the main event of John chapter 11 is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So when you come into the beginning part of John chapter 12, there is a feast that is being given in honor of Jesus for having raised Lazarus from the dead. And as this feast is going on, Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister, comes into the feast, and she brings an alabaster vial or bottle, an alabaster bottle of precious ointment, breaks the bottle open, and just lavishly and extravagantly takes this extraordinarily expensive ointment and begins to anoint Jesus with that ointment. It's a gift of gratitude. It's a gift of honor. It's a gift of thanksgiving. And it's a gift that in some ways that Mary, even at that moment, didn't understand. But Jesus will explain later was a gift that looked backwards, but it also looked forwards. She understood the looking backwards. She was looking back at what Jesus had done to rescue her brother and to restore their family to wholeness. She had no idea that in this act, Jesus would also tell her to look forward to the fact that she was in advance preparing him for burial, because his death is just around the corner. When we come to John chapter 12, we're on the very threshold of the triumphal entry, and Passion Week is right around the corner. And so she breaks open this alabaster jar, and she begins to pour out this ointment, and the fragrance fills the room. And here's where Judas steps in. And it says in verse 4, "But Judas Iskariot, one of his disciples," here it is again, "who was intending to betray him, said, 'Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people?'" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money bag, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Now let's just kind of sit with that for a moment. The first thing we get is there's this very natural good guy response. I mean, if John didn't give us an editorial note to tell us otherwise, it would be easy to think, wow, this is an extravagant gift, and yes, it's a lavish gift, and yes, it's a wonderful expression of Mary's love, but 300 denarii? Really? I mean, a denarii was the equivalent of a day's wage for a day laborer in first century Israel. So when you have 300 denarii, you're looking at close to a year's salary. Now you think for just a minute, if you're working and you have a job and you get paid, what's your annual salary? Imagine that's what this is. And whether you think you don't make very much money or whether you think you make a lot, whatever you make, it would feed a lot of hungry people. It would help a lot of poor people. And so when we hear Judas's comment, it would be really easy to think, wow, you know what? Judas has a point. He's very socially aware. He's very socially conscious. Man, I like this guy. He's sensitive to the needs of others. And yes, it's right to honor Jesus. Yes, it's right to show gratitude and thanksgiving. That's very important. But also, aren't we called to help the poor? Aren't we called to try to feed the hungry? Certainly we are. And it would be very easy if all we had was that to say, you know what, he's making a pretty good point here, folks. This is a really good point. But then John, very helpfully, writing some 60 years later, gives us his little editorial note. Now, he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money bag, he used to pilfer from it. All of a sudden, this entire event takes a different tone, doesn't it? All of a sudden, instead of this bright light of concern for the poor, we have this dark shadow of double intentions and manipulation and desire to protect self. And here you have Judas using this as an opportunity to attack Mary under false pretense, making himself look good by trying to make her look bad. But not only did John understand, and by the way, we know that Judas is going to die. He's going to take his own life. We'll see that in the second session. But it would have been very easy after Judas died for the disciples to look at the money bag and to see, there's not as much here as there's supposed to be. And then to find out, you know what? That's exactly what was happening. So I don't think John's just making this up. I think John's telling us facts that they learned later and inserted into the story so we could understand that Judas's heart was not for generosity to the poor. Judas's heart was plainly to restore to the bag what he had stolen from it in the very least, or at the very most, to make the bag more full so he had more he could pilfer. But what's really interesting is not just this clear statement of Judas's motive, important as that is. I mean, there's so many times in the Bible where somebody does something And you'll hear somebody like me who's doing a Bible teaching session say, now here's why they did that. Well, if the text doesn't tell us why they did it, we don't know why they did it. If the text doesn't tell us why they did it, all we know is that they did it. We don't know why they did it. And we need to let that sit there for a minute. But the reality is this. John tells us why they did it. John tells us he did it because he was a thief and because he stole from the bag. And at that moment, Judas not only has taken center stage in terms of the story, and we see him active and speaking for the first time, but also he's going to be challenged by Jesus directly for the first time. And that comes in Jesus' response. Then, therefore, Jesus said in verse 7, let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Now that last part, it's easy to think, well, that's kind of harsh. I mean, aren't we supposed to be concerned about poor people? Yes, you are. But what Jesus is not saying is, hey, take care of me, don't take care of them. No, what he's saying is, listen, all the time you have the opportunity to take care of them, and you should be doing that. But right now, in this moment, there are other things that need to be cared for, like preparation for my burial. There's also a little interesting note here that I'd never really noticed before until I was digging into this. When Jesus said, let her alone, there's an idea of almost physical restraint. There's almost this idea that when Judas goes after Mary for pouring out this ointment, this fragrant ointment, that he physically does something with her. And it's almost like Jesus is saying, take your hands off her. Take your hands off her. Leave her alone. Judas, in a sense, is accosting her, and Jesus is confronting him. Now, this creates a really interesting tension and dynamic within the room, because you have Jesus, and you have Mary, and then you have Judas. And Judas confronts Mary, and then Jesus confronts Judas. Now, some say that perhaps the reason why Judas decides to go sell Jesus out is because of this, that this is the actual trigger that causes his actions. And it may be the trigger that caused his action, but it's not what made him think about, well, I don't like this guy, I'm going to betray him. No, I mean, it's said very clearly in verse 4, but Judas Iskariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him. He already had it in his mind that he was going to do this. He already had it in his mind that he was going to betray Jesus and to sell him out. This may have been the last straw that forced him into action, that forced him to step forward, that forced him to go through in activity what he had only been thinking about in his mind. But what's interesting about this is that if we believe Jesus is who he claimed to be, and I do, I believe he's the Son of God. I believe he is every bit as much God in human flesh as he was in eternity past before the worlds were created. I believe he was God, and I believe as a result of that, he had knowledge. And I believe when he called Judas to be one of his disciples, he knew that Judas was going to betray him. And there's some mystery in that, because some would say, well, why pick him then? Why pick him if you know that this is what he's going to do? And there's some mystery there that we don't know. But what we do know is that the betrayal would take place from one of Jesus's close disciples. Because even in the Old Testament, we read about the fact that one of his dear friends would lift up his heel. David said in Psalm 41, verse 9, even my close friend whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. You say, well, what's that have to do with Judas? Well, in John 13, verse 18, Jesus quotes that in reference to Judas. See, even in the Old Testament, it was laid out and mapped out that when the betrayal comes, it's going to be from one of Jesus's close friends. One of Jesus's close friends. And we will see that amplified times 10 when we're in part 2 and we see the actual event of the betrayal itself. Judas was my close friend who I trusted. And yet, following this event of Jesus publicly confronting him, for publicly confronting Mary, he begins to enact his preparations. And they are, in fact, preparations for betrayal. And these preparations actually have three different components to them. And I want us to look at each one because each one plays a part in the story. The first are the human actions of Judas himself. And we see this really stated well in Matthew 16, verses 14 through 16. It says, "Then one of the 12, named Judas Iskariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?' And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. And from then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus." Matthew 26, 14 through 16. What are you willing to offer me to betray him? Now, once again, we see money is at the core of the issue, just like it was in John 12. 300 denarii, a lot of money. Judas, he's the guy with the money bag. Now, once again, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to get paid. They offered him 30 pieces of silver, which really actually wasn't very much. It certainly wasn't very much compared to 300 denarii, but 30 pieces of silver, we'll see in a few moments, was the price of a slave. It was a price of the slave, and Jesus, who became the chief slave and servant of all, was sold out by his close, trusted friend for the price of a slave. That's Judas's human action as he goes to the priests and offers to do this. Now, the question that has come up over the years is why? And we said a few moments ago, so many times we see actions in the Bible by people, but no motive is attached. And people will say, well, it's because of this, or it's because of this, or it's because of this. We don't know. But I think there are several possibilities that really deserve some careful thought. One possibility is, as we saw earlier, some think that the thing that pushed him over the edge was that rebuke in John chapter 12. And certainly in terms of the timing, that would make sense, because immediately following John chapter 12 is the upper room beginning in John 13. And it's from there that Jesus sends him out and he goes away to betray Jesus. So that's very much a part of it, but we don't know if it is the thing or not. Some say that Judas betrayed him because Jesus refused to establish the kingdom. This goes back to the theory that maybe he was a Sicarii, maybe he was one of the zealots, maybe he was one of those that sanctioned and approved and even was willing to participate in the violent overthrow of the Roman Empire. Maybe, we don't know. But if so, Jesus' refusal, even when there were times when the people were clamoring for him to be made a king, and Jesus refused, that if that was what Judas's dream was, then his dream was shattered by Jesus' refusal to be named king. Some speculate that maybe Judas betrayed Jesus in order to try to take attention off of himself and to cover up his stealing from the money bag. But I think beyond anything else, perhaps something that makes sense, and it makes sense to me. Again, this is speculation. We don't know for sure, but it makes sense to me that perhaps Judas betrayed Jesus because after being with Jesus for 3 years, he was disappointed with Jesus. He was disappointed with Jesus. Things just weren't as he had hoped they would be. Things just weren't as he had thought they would be. And as a result, over time, he became more and more disenchanted and just decided, I've wasted 3 years of my life and I've got nothing to show for it. But maybe if I betray him and hand him over to them and deliver him to them, maybe then I can at least get something out of this wasted 3 years of my life. Now, again, we don't know. But clearly, something was badly wrong within Judas that opened the door for a bunch of other things. And one of the things that opened the door for was the second of these three components of the preparations for the betrayal. And this was actually satanic involvement. Listen to these verses. In John 13:2, during supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. John 13:27, after the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Then in Luke 22, verse 3, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. Satan entered into. This is interesting because throughout the Gospels, we see a number of times where individuals are possessed or indwelt or empowered or in some way controlled and dominated by demonic presences, by demonic persons. This is that over-the-top rare occasion where it is Satan himself, the prince of darkness, the old serpent, who himself takes possession of Judas's life. Now, understand, some people will hear that and they will say, well, how can it be Judas's fault what he did? How can it be Judas's fault if it was Satan in him doing this stuff? And the answer is this: Judas made himself open to Satan's entrance. He made himself available. Just as in some way Peter made himself available by rebuking Jesus in Matthew 16, and Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. You're my adversary. You're opposed to me. You're against what I'm saying. Don't open yourself up to that. I need you and want you with me, not against me. Judas, one of the 12, who had been with Jesus, now, whether it's through disappointment or through anger at Jesus for not assuming kingship, whatever the reason might be, Judas opened himself to this, and he is responsible for that. God is sovereign. God is in control. But we make choices, and we have to own our choices. And that's what's being talked about in Luke 17:1 when it says, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. And even more markedly in Mark 14, verse 21, Jesus says, for the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe be to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Do you see the tension there? There's a theological tension there between the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man. Yes, it's going to be as it must be. Yes, it's going to be as the Father planned. Yes, it's going to be as the Scriptures predicted. But Judas makes a choice. Judas makes a choice to put himself in alliance with the forces of darkness and allows Satan entrance into his life. And as such, he becomes not just a traitor, but a tragic traitor. A traitor who has sinned against the very Son of God himself in the most profound way. So you have the human actions and you have the satanic involvement, but you also have what I would call the prophetic reality, because again, this was prophesied in the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus took David's words in Psalm 41, my friend, the one that I trusted, he's the one who's lifted up his heel against me. That's what Jesus applied to Judas as an Old Testament prophecy, but there's more. Psalm 55, which I and others believe was speaking of Ahithophel, David's most trusted counselor and advisor. David said, for it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it, nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, and my familiar friend, that, while speaking of Ahithophel's treachery toward David, anticipates the even greater treachery of Judas against Jesus. In fact, not only was the very act of betrayal prophesied, but in Acts chapter 1, following Judas's suicide, it is Peter who reaches back into the Old Testament to Psalm 109 as a reason and a justification for adding back in someone to take Judas's place, because he quotes from the psalm saying, let another take his office. And he viewed that clearly as a prophecy predicting the events surrounding Judas and his tragic choices. Beyond that, even further, hundreds of years before these events would take place, the prophet Zechariah wrote these words, "So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver." Again, the amount of price that you would pay for a slave. And that is in one of the most messianic books in the Old Testament, the book of Zechariah. Say, how's all this come together? Well, again, there's mystery, and we need to acknowledge that and allow for that and recognize that. But there's also reality. And the reality is this. Even though I believe Jesus knew that Judas would ultimately betray him, Jesus never stopped reaching out to him. Jesus never stopped appealing to him or showing compassion to him or showing mercy to him. That Judas would ultimately, eventually reject all of that makes his story all the more tragic. But think about it. Knowing of the betrayal that would come, Jesus selected him anyway and welcomed him into the group to live in the presence of Jesus physically and personally. It's amazing. He entrusted him with the group's resources as a sign of friendship and honor. At the Last Supper, before Judas goes out, Peter leans over to John, who's sitting next to Jesus, and says, "Ask him who the betrayer is going to be." And John leans over and says, Who is it, Lord, who's going to betray you? And he says, "It's the one to whom I give the morsel," or the sop. And it's a very important custom at Passover that the host of the feast, in this case Jesus, the host of the feast, would take a piece of unleavened bread and would put lamb in it and some of the vegetables, radishes, some of the different things from around the table, and would kind of wrap it up and dip it into the paste on the table and hand it to someone. And the someone who he would hand that to as the host of the feast would be the one considered the honored guest. The honored guest. Here, Jesus continues to reach out and reach out and reach out and reach out and reach out. And Judas continues to reject. It's very interesting. Judas, whose name means praise to the Lord, lived in the very presence of Jesus. Lived in the presence of the one whom John's gospel refers to as the light of the world. And he lived in the presence of that light for 3 years. And so in the upper room, when Jesus hands him the morsel, and Judas takes it, and Jesus says, "What you do, do quickly." It says, Judas then went out and departed from them. And then John adds this very cryptic footnote at the end with just these words, "And it was night." And it was night. And you say, well, that's interesting. I mean, okay, it was evening, it was past sundown. No, there's something going on here, because if you really pay attention when you study the Gospel of John, you know that one of the key characteristics of the Gospel of John is that he's constantly comparing light versus darkness, light versus darkness. And we see that in the very beginning in chapter 1, referring to Jesus, "In him was life, and that life was the light of men." Jesus was light. Again, John 8 and John 9. He is the light of the world. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. He is the light of the world. He proved he was the light of the world by bringing light into the darkened eyes of a man in John 9 who had been born blind. Light versus darkness, light versus darkness, light versus darkness. And in this moment in the upper room, as Jesus hands Judas the sop, Judas doesn't just leave the upper room and go out into the night. He leaves the light of the world and goes out into the darkness and the forces of darkness. Very interesting. If we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, you find our first parents, the man and the woman, Adam and Eve. And prior to Genesis chapter 3, they were living in perfect harmony with each other. Perfect harmony with creation. Perfect harmony with the Creator. In the cool of the evening, The Creator would come and walk with them in the cool of the day, and they would have communion and perfect, unrestricted, unhindered, unblemished fellowship with God. They lived in the presence of God physically. And somehow it wasn't enough. And that not enoughness cracked open a door that the serpent, the enemy, the Satan, the adversary was able to slip into and say, really? You could have more. There's more. And it's just playing on that disappointment. The disappointment of someone who had lived in the very presence of God, but somehow in some way was able to be beguiled because somehow that wasn't enough. The exact same thing applies to Judas. Judas spends 3 years in the physical presence of God in human flesh. He spends 3 years living in the basking glory of the Son of God. And somehow it ended up being not enough. And when it became not enough, that opened a crack. And the serpent was able to sneak in. And it was night as he went out into the darkness to carry out his treacherous deed. I can't prove that in verses in the Bible, but I believe the parallels between Adam and Eve and Judas are stunning. Stunning. And I believe as we think about that and think about the Christ and all that he had done in Judas's presence, it becomes all the more tragic that Judas would turn his back on Jesus and reject him. And not just reject him, betray him. Judas, the tragic traitor. Think about that. And think about your own. And I've had to think about my own susceptibility to areas in my own life which are vulnerable to darkness, which are vulnerable to the enemy, and to consider, what must I do by God's grace and the help of the Holy Spirit to protect those places so that my heart can stay wholly devoted to him. Well, let's pray. Then we'll have a little brief intermission, and then we'll come back with part 2. Father, we look at a person like Judas and we find it confusing and mysterious and disturbing, but most of all, we find it shocking. And we find ourselves like the other disciples in the upper room when Jesus said, one of you will betray me. And they all said, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? And Father, as I find myself looking at Judas, I find myself asking, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Lord, help me keep my eyes fixed on you. Help me to embrace your enoughness and allow myself to trust you and rest in you and find in you more than enough to satisfy my soul. Father, help me to learn from the brokenness of Judas that I might trust you with my own brokenness and that you could make me whole. In Jesus' name, amen.